The cornfields surrounding my rural hometown always seemed harmless enough during the day, just rolling acres of tall green stalks, swaying gently in the summer breeze. But at night, there was something ominous and foreboding about the vast, dark maze of vegetation. If you've never been deep in a Midwestern cornfield at night, let me tell you, those neat and tidy rows you see from the road disappear once you're surrounded on all sides by towering walls of corn that block out the moonlight. And the silence. The silence is absolutely deafening. One hot August night when I was 17, when the corn was at its peak height nearly over my head, I decided to sneak through Old Man Thompson's south field to meet up with some friends on the other side. It was a dangerous stunt considering Thompson's reputation for shooting trespassers first and asking questions later. But it was the fastest way to get to the old abandoned barn where we hung out. I waited until midnight, when I figured Thompson would be sound asleep. The full moon illuminated the neat dirt path I followed through the rows, casting a dim glow through the corn stalks. Aside from the thud of my footsteps and the rustling of thousands of leaves in the light breeze, all was quiet and still. At least at first. About halfway through the field, I started to get an uneasy feeling, that creeping sensation of being watched. I paused and glanced around warily. The shadows between the rows now seemed menacing and dark. A murder of crows suddenly took flight from a nearby tree, startling me badly. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. Just a few more minutes of walking and I'd be with my friends sharing a joint behind the old barn, brushing off my overactive imagination. But that's when I heard it. From deep within the cornfield came a low, rasping breath, followed by what sounded like a whimper of pain. Every hair on my body went on high alert. It wasn't natural, whatever was making that noise. I felt frozen to the ground as my blood turned to ice in my veins. And that's when I saw it. A dark, hulking figure emerged from between the rows and stumbled onto the path a mere 30 feet from where I stood. I couldn't make out any features, only the massive, shadowy outline of something that seemed both man and beast. A charcoal gray hand reached out, thick fingers topped with jagged nails that were almost claws. Another guttural cry escaped the creature, followed by a chilling mix of broken English and grunts. "Get out my field. You die." My paralysis broke, and I sprinted back the way I came, passing the spot where I had entered the corn and going beyond where the path widened into Thompson's fallow vegetable field. Yet the thing thundered after me relentlessly. At one point, I risked a glance back and saw it running on all fours like an animal, its broad shoulders rising above the corn. When I reached the far edge of the vegetable plot, I could tell the creature was closing in fast. In utter desperation, I dove straight into the cornfield on the other side, recklessly fighting my way through the stalks in a dead run. The monster followed for a time until my stumbling route apparently confused it. Eventually, its roaring faded, yet I kept running until I cleared the cornfield, panting and covered in sweat, on the far side over a mile from where my journey started. After a string of panicked calls, my older brother rescued me, shell-shocked by the side of the road. We returned at dawn before the Thompsons awoke to retrieve my dropped cell phone from the path where I'd first encountered the thing in the corn. No one in town believed such a creature actually existed, thinking I was either drunk, high, or just spinning tall tales. But the proof was right there in the dirt, a long set of clawed paw prints intersecting with my sneaker tracks. I'm 45 now, and haven't returned to my hometown since graduating high school. Yet the nightmares of being chased through tangled stalks by that faceless corn monster continue to wake me in a sweat to this day. And I still can't look at any cornfield, without remembering the rancid breath, the guttural grunts, and that one blood-curdling phrase, "You die." The night air was crisp as Bill walked along the dirt path on the edge of the Petersons' cornfield. The corn was nearly ready for harvest, towering over him at its full 10-foot height. He cursed himself for taking the shortcut home after leaving Duke's Tavern, but it shaved nearly half a mile off his trip back to the house. His boots crunched over the gravel and dried corn husks scattered across the ground as he walked. The hoot of an owl made Bill peer uneasily into the rows of corn, but he brushed away his nervousness, chalking it up to one too many whiskey sours. As he passed the old windmill near the heart of the field, its blades eerily creaking in the still air, the corn stalks suddenly shook violently with a rattling like bones. Bill's breath caught in his throat as a dark humanoid figure darted between the rows, its movements erratic and limbs twisting unnaturally. "No, just my mind playing tricks on me," Bill tried to assure himself, picking up his pace. But as he hurried along between the rows of stalks, now higher than his head, a pale, gaunt face seemed to suddenly emerge from the corn. Bill stumbled back in terror. It had sunken, coal-black eyes, and leathery skin stretched tight over its skull, patches hanging loose as if decaying off the bone. The creature opened its mouth in a silent scream, showing jagged yellow teeth sharp as knives. Bill panicked and ran blindly down the dirt path, corn stalks whipping at him, cobwebs clinging to his face. His heart pounded almost out of his chest, drowning out any other sounds but the rushing of blood in his ears. After what seemed an eternity, the rows of corn opened up and he burst out the other side into the open harvest field beyond, chest heaving and legs unsteady beneath him. As Bill glanced back over his shoulder toward that narrow, towering corridor of corn stalks, his blood turned to ice. Dozens of horrific creatures were pouring out from the cornfield, moving in unnatural, twisted motions, some crawling, some staggering forward. Their tattered clothes were soaked in old blood, skin sagging off them almost to the bone. As they drew closer, their growls grew louder, underlaid with shrieks that sounded almost human. They reached toward Bill with long, bony arms ending in gnarled hands and sharp, broken claws. Sobbing in panic, Bill began to run again, the lights of his house now in view across the wider field, though they seemed impossibly far. The monstrous beings pursued him relentlessly, impossibly fast. Some had organs or even limbs missing, oozing thick black ichor. He cried out as foul-smelling fingers grasped the back of his jacket, sharp nails raking across his skin. Lurching free, Bill put on a last desperate burst of speed, seeing with tremendous relief the back door of his house directly ahead, blazing with light. His hand grasped the doorknob just as the onrush of grunting, shrieking horrors crashed into him. Bill screamed as they overwhelmed him in a maelstrom of rending claws, biting teeth, and screaming that went on and on and on and on in the empty farmland, with no one to hear. I braced myself for the killing bite, but it never came. The foaming jaws snapped shut just inches from my face, then vanished back into the undulating walls of corn. My heart pounded out of my chest as I gasped for breath, too terrified to move. The stalks shook with unseen movement, while inhuman wails pierced the heavy air. It sounded like a dozen or more beasts circled hungrily. But the ravenous attack I feared had stopped short. Cautiously, I peered through the rustling stalks, searching for signs of the nightmares. Had they only been toying with me? Why prolong my torment? Then I detected words buried within the guttural shrieks. Garbled phrases barked with animal fury in some primal proto-language. "Trespasser!" The corn seemed to roar. "This land protected. Turn back." I shuddered with realization. The corn was warning me, commanding me to leave this cursed acreage. Slowly, the terrifying truth dawned on me. Some ancient power guarded this remote farmland and had shaped spectral defenders from the crops themselves. For the first time, I pitied the poor damned farmer who had planted these monster-infested fields. The savage roars rose to deafening levels as I scrambled to my feet. I raised my arms in desperate plea for mercy. Then I fled, like never before, zigzagging blindly through the living maze as disembodied claws grasped from all sides. At last, I burst from the farm edge onto Blacktop Highway, where I collapsed breathless on the shoulder. Turning back toward that eldritch cornfield lair, I witnessed the crop visibly shrink back from the road's paved boundary, while its otherworldly inhabitants howled furiously from within the shrinking perimeter. Safe outside their domain, I shuddered with relief. Wasting no time, I raced to my battered old truck parked down the road. As I fired up the engine, planning to drive non-stop into the next county, a final unearthly wail rose from that forsaken farmland I had so foolishly trespassed. Never again, I swore to myself. Never again would I dare enter any rural cornfield in this godforsaken state. I gunned the pickup forward and didn't slow down for miles till I reached the nearest gas station. The old codger behind the counter eyed me warily as I stumbled through the door, uniform shredded, legs caked with dirt, face white as a ghost. I realized suddenly how deranged I must look after barely escaping that eldritch horror with my life. "Rough day in the fields, eh, son?" The old-timer chuckled. I stared back, still in shock, and I saw his smirk and seethed with anger. The isolated locals must know. How could he joke about the unholy terror festering behind the rural roads that framed his store? I had just moved to a small rural town in Iowa. My house sat on 5 acres of land, most of which was an overgrown cornfield that the previous owners had long since stopped tending to. The first week there, I explored the property. The corn was nearly 10 feet tall in some spots, making it impossible to see very far. The stillness of it was eerie. It felt as though the field could swallow me up at any moment. A few nights later, a huge summer storm hit. As I lay in bed, flashes of lightning illuminated the cornfield outside my window in sporadic bursts. The wind whipped the corn stalks back and forth violently. It sounded alive out there, like there were 1,000 voices whispering and feet trampling through the field. The noises grew louder, closer. I peered out the window, but it was pitch black between the lightning flashes. Just then, a bright flash lit up the cornfield. I froze in sheer horror at what I saw. There were dozens of pale, ghostly figures wandering slowly through the rows of corn, their blank eyes staring straight at me. I blinked hard when the darkness returned, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But with each successive flash, the haunting scene remained. The figures crept closer, the eerie whispers and rustling corn growing deafening even through closed windows. I was paralyzed by fear. I knew I needed to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't budge. The pale corpses of men, women, and children were now at the edge of the field, their bony arms reaching for me as they uttered unintelligible groans. When a particularly bright flash illuminated their skeletal faces, just feet from my window, mouths open in agony, I finally snapped out of my terrified state. I leapt out of bed, screaming, and ran out of the house into the stormy night, the manic whispers and shuffling footsteps close behind me. I kept running through the muddy cornfield in blind panic. I could hear the figures surrounding me but couldn't see anything in the darkness. Then I tripped over something large and soft. Horror boiled up inside me as I looked down to see I had tripped over a corpse, though not one of the paranormal beings chasing me. As flickers of lightning revealed the scene, I saw lifeless bodies of real people scattered around me as far as I could see. Men, women, elderly, teenagers, small children, bodies in various states of decay littered the cornfield. Another bright flash exposed a dark figure standing directly over me. I scrambled back in terror before realizing it was the sheriff. He explained a serial killer had been hiding the bodies of his victims here for decades without detection. Tonight's violent storm had stirred up the spirits, metaphorically and literally. As I clung to the sheriff, shaking and crying among the dozens of corpses, I knew this cornfield would haunt me forever. It was a hot and humid summer night when I decided to take a walk down the long dirt road that runs alongside the old cornfield just outside of town. I had walked this way many times before, but something felt different about this night. The corn stalks were tall and ominously swayed in the breeze, casting jagged shadows across the road in the dim moonlight. I continued walking slowly down the deserted road, gravel crunching under my feet, scanning the edge of the field apprehensively. About halfway down, I heard a strange rustling noise emanate from the cornfield, like something large quickly moving through the stalks. I froze, peering into the inky darkness between the rows of corn, but couldn't see anything. The sound stopped abruptly. It's just some kind of animal, I told myself. I quickened my pace slightly, hoping to get past this section of the field, wanting to get back home. Then the screaming started. Blood, curdling, horrifying screams of what sounded like a woman in complete distress, coming from somewhere deep in the cornfield. Without thinking, I ran toward the screams, crashing through the stalks and dried corn leaves. I discovered a yawning pit 20 feet across, gaping black in the moonlight. The stench hit me like a wave. At the bottom lay the partially decayed corpses of men and women. Some seemed to have been dead for years, little more than skeletons in tattered clothing. Others looked fresher, fermenting in the summer heat. Rats skittered away from their feasting as I stared, shuddering but unable to look away. The screams had ceased, but now I heard what sounded like muffled crying coming from a large wooden box nearby, nails driven crudely into its lid. I reached toward it slowly. Suddenly, an axe smashed down inches from my hand, wielded by a hulking, twisted figure that seemed to have emerged straight from the pit itself. I turned and fled through the stalks, sharp leaves whipping my face, the monster's footsteps heavy behind me. I didn't dare look back. Just as I broke through the edge of the field onto the road, my foot caught on something, and I sprawled forward, pain shooting through my ankle. I looked down to see a grinning skull lodged in the dirt, spine trailing off into the corn. As I struggled to my feet, I heard the monster closing in. I hobbled desperately along that lonely dirt road beneath the indifferent moon, its pale light illuminating the endless rows of corn that now hid unimaginable horrors. I could still hear the thing crashing behind me as I ran and ran, the screams echoing in my ears. It was a hot summer night when we decided to walk through the old cornfield just for fun. My friends, Mike, Jenny, and I used to explore all over this small rural town we grew up in. We must have been about 16 years old at the time. The corn stalks towered over us. leaves brushing against our faces as we ventured further into the rows and rows of corn that seemed never-ending. After about 15 minutes of walking, we came across an old, dilapidated farmhouse. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. The paint was peeling, every window was busted out, and the wooden door to the house creaked on its hinges in the wind. Mike dared Jenny to go inside the house, and she took on the challenge. Mike and I waited by the side of the house as Jenny slowly walked up the porch steps, testing each one to make sure they wouldn't collapse underneath her. She peered inside the front door into complete darkness. Every horror movie we had ever seen flashed before my mind, but Jenny showed no fear. She pulled out a small flashlight from her backpack and shined it into the house. From where I was standing, I couldn't see anything other than complete emptiness inside. Mike and I watched nervously as Jenny took a few steps into the house. Then everything went quiet. "Jenny," Mike shouted, but there was no response. Mike and I looked at each other with dread. Why wasn't she responding? It was dead silent for what felt like forever. I shouted, "Jenny, this isn't funny. Come out now." Still silence. By now my heart was racing, and panic started to flood my body with adrenaline. Mike decided he would go in after her. I pleaded for him not to. I tried shining my flashlight inside to get a glimpse of Jenny or Mike, but I couldn't see anything from my vantage point. Then I heard Mike screaming at the top of his lungs from inside the abandoned house, yelling "HELP! OHMYGOD! HELP!" Then dead silence once again. Tears began to fill my eyes. What was happening? I desperately shined my light inside over and over, but it was pitch blackness. I started to scream, COMEBODYHELPME. But we were so deep into the cornfield that I knew nobody would hear me. I dropped to my knees, crawled into a ball, and rocked back and forth crying, alone for what felt like hours. What seemed like an eternity was probably only 30 minutes in reality. That's when the wooden front door creaked open ever so slowly. My breath caught in my throat. Someone or something was coming out. A dark figure appeared crouched in the doorway. I clenched my flashlight in my hand, ready to bash whatever was emerging. The figure then sprang forward, sprinting straight at me as fast as possible. I fell backwards, screaming, and kicked my feet to push myself away. That's when I realized it was Jenny and Mike. They busted out laughing, having played an evil trick on me. Jenny explained they had secretly found the back door to the house and ran around while screaming to prank me. I was shaking and furious at them for doing that. Jenny and Mike couldn't stop laughing, but their smiles soon faded when we heard a loud crash come from the abandoned house. All three of us slowly turned our heads back to look, eyes wide like saucers, realizing we weren't alone out there after all. The front door then slammed shut by itself. We all screamed and ran like we had never run before back through that cornfield to get as far away from that farmhouse as possible. We never went near that cornfield ever again, and I still have nightmares to this day. I had just moved to rural Iowa after getting a job as a crop insurance adjuster. I was driving down a deserted country road on my way to appoint a claim for storm damage. As I navigated the endless seas of tall corn stalks on either side, I noticed the sky darkening quickly. Before I knew it, the clouds opened up and it began to pour. The dirt road quickly turned to mud, and my tires slid across the muck. I slowed to a crawl, but my car fishtailed wildly with each attempt to steer. Suddenly, my back tire dropped into a deep rut, and I felt the car sinking. I tried hitting the gas to power out, but the wheels just spun, splattering my windows with grime. I had no choice but to get out into the storm to dig myself out. The corn towered over me, stalks thick as baseball bats, leaves dagger sharp. Each row seemed identical to the next, and the mud sucked at my shoes. My clothes were soaked and heavy within minutes. I couldn't tell which way I had come from, or which way to go for help. The sky flashed and thunder cracked so close my ears rang. The storm shook the stalks, and they clattered together loudly. I called out, but the rain drowned my voice. I slogged through the mud until I came upon a small clearing. The corn had been trampled in a circle, and debris was scattered around. I saw tattered clothes, shards of pottery, a moth-eaten doll, and bones, human bones. As I drew closer, lightning flashed and illuminated the scene. The bones had been arranged ritualistically around a makeshift stone altar that bore ominous carvings. The altar was stained a dark maroon. Was it blood? A low moan rose from the depths of the field behind me. I whirled around but saw only whipping stalks. I told myself it was the wind, but it came again, closer, an agonized cry. There was such suffering, such pain in the sound that my stomach knotted in dread. The wailing continued, multiplying into a chorus of anguish emanating from all sides. I ran through the mud, but the woeful lament followed me. Suddenly, the corn erupted before me. Shrieking ghosts with hollow eyes and desiccated limbs flew at me, mouths open in silent screams. I choked on a shriek as they swarmed around me, passing through my body with icy shocks. Their whispers filled my mind. "Join us," they crooned. "We are the Forgotten Ones." I bolted in blind terror. The corn slashed my arms and face, but I did not slow. The ghosts pursued me. I could feel their skeletal fingers clutching at my clothes from behind. Finally, I broke free onto the road, but my car was nowhere in sight. Ahead stood an old farmhouse, sagging and abandoned. I stumbled toward the porch just as the full fury of the storm crashed upon me. Thunder boomed. Lightning seared the sky. The corn thrashed in a frenzy. From the black clouds descended the ghosts, howling for my soul. The corn stalks towered over me, easily 12 feet tall as I wandered through the never-ending rows. I had been walking for what felt like hours, with no sign of an exit from this green labyrinth. As the sun began to set, the aisles between the rows grew dark and foreboding. I stumbled on in the fading light, hungry, thirsty, and increasingly panic-stricken. How did I end up here? The last thing I remember was pulling over to check my phone's GPS, frustrated at having gotten lost on these narrow rural roads. The corn must have already been 4 feet high or more, making it impossible to see over. I got out of my car to walk to higher ground and get my bearings. Almost immediately, I was swallowed up in the corn and couldn't find my way back. Just as true night fell, I began to hear noises in the corn around me. Rustlings that I told myself must be rabbits or other small animals. But they grew louder and more frequent, seeming to follow me through the stalks no matter which way I ran. Then came moans and wails, wordless cries of fury or sorrow rising from multiple directions. I ran faster, my heart pounding with terror, until through the gaps I could make out pale, emaciated figures pulling themselves through the corn. Their eyes were crazed, their mouths opened impossibly wide as another anguished howl came out. I screamed and sprinted to a nearby clearing, cowering as they surrounded me in a circle, these ghostly apparitions. Their unnaturally long limbs reached out and I knew there was no escape. This must be where they brought their victims, to be forever lost in this wicked crop. As they set upon me, I wished that I had never taken this fateful detour and entered this otherworldly domain of the damned cornfield. My scream echoed through the stalks as they tore into my flesh, pulling me down into the dark dirt below.